Our subject tonight is belief in God reasonable? On April 8, 1966, Time magazine carried a cover story for which the cover was completely black, except for 3 words emblazoned in bright red letters against the dark background. And the words read, "Is God dead?" And the story described the movement among contemporary theologians to proclaim the death of God. But to paraphrase Mark Twain, it seems that the news of God's demise was greatly exaggerated. For at the same time that the theologians were writing God's obituary, a new generation of young philosophers was rediscovering his vitality. This was something radically new. You see, back in the 1940s and 50s, it was widely believed among philosophers that talk about God is literally meaningless, since it is not verifiable by the 5 senses. According to verificationism, only sentences that are empirically verifiable are meaningful. And since sentences about God were not empirically verifiable, talk about God was just nonsense. The collapse of this verificationism was undoubtedly the most important philosophical event of the 20th century. Its downfall meant a resurgence of metaphysics, along with all of the other traditional problems of philosophy, which had been suppressed by verificationism. And accompanying this resurgence came something new and altogether unexpected, a renaissance of Christian philosophy. The turning point probably came in 1967 with Alvin Plantinga's publication of his book, God and Other Minds. In this treatise, Plantinga applied the tools of analytic philosophy to questions in the philosophy of religion with an unprecedented rigor and creativity. And in his train has followed a host of Christian philosophers, writing in professional journals, participating in professional societies, and publishing with the finest academic presses. The face of Anglo-American philosophy has been transformed as a result. Atheism, though probably still the dominant point of view at the university, is now a philosophy in retreat. In a recent article, University of Western Michigan philosopher Quentin Smith laments what he calls the desecularization of academia that evolved in philosophy departments since the late 1960s. Complaining of naturalists' passivity in the face of the wave of intelligent and talented theists entering academia today, Smith concludes, and I quote, "God is not dead in academia. He returned to life in the late 1960s and is now alive and well in his last academic stronghold, philosophy departments." This renaissance of Christian philosophy has been accompanied by a resurgence of interest in natural theology. Natural theology is that branch of theology which is devoted to arguments for the existence of God, apart from the resources of authoritative divine revelation. All of the traditional arguments for God's existence, such as the cosmological, teleological, moral, and ontological arguments, not to mention creative new arguments, find intelligent and articulate defenders in the contemporary philosophical scene. But what, you might ask, about the new atheists, exemplified by Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris? Doesn't this movement herald a reversal of this trend? Well, not really. As is evident from the authors that it interacts with, or rather fails to interact with, the new atheism is actually a pop cultural phenomenon, lacking in intellectual muscle and blissfully ignorant of the revolution that has transpired in Anglo-American philosophy. It tends to reflect the scientism of a bygone generation rather than the contemporary intellectual scene. As a professional philosopher, I believe that the existence of God explains a vast array of the data of human experience. And this evening, I would like to mention briefly 8 such data. Number 1, then, God is the best explanation of why anything at all exists. Suppose you were walking through the forest and found a ball lying on the ground. You would naturally wonder how it came to be there. If your hiking buddy said to you, just forget about it, it just exists inexplicably, you would think that either he was joking or that he just wanted you to keep moving. Nobody would take seriously the idea that the ball just exists with literally no explanation. Now, notice that merely increasing the size of the ball, even until it becomes coextensive with the universe, does nothing to provide or remove the need for an explanation of its existence. So, what is the explanation of the existence of the universe? Whereby the universe, I mean all of space-time reality. The explanation of the universe can lie only in a transcendent reality beyond the universe, beyond space and time, which is metaphysically necessary in its existence. Now, there is only one way that I can think of to get a contingent entity like the universe from a necessarily existing cause. And that is if the cause is a personal agent who can freely choose to create a contingent reality. It therefore follows that the best explanation of the existence of the contingent universe is a transcendent personal being, which is what everybody means by God. We can summarize this argument as follows. Premise 1, every contingent thing has an explanation of its existence. 2, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is a transcendent personal being. 3, the universe is a contingent thing. Now, what follows logically from those 3 premises? Well, 4, therefore the universe has an explanation of its existence. And 5, therefore the explanation of the universe is a transcendent personal being, which is what everybody means by God. Number 2, God is the best explanation of the origin of the universe. We now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. In 2003, 3 cosmologists, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, were able to prove that any universe which is, on average, in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. What makes their proof so powerful is that it holds regardless of the physical description of the early universe. Because we don't yet have a quantum theory of gravity, we can't yet provide a physical description of that first split second of the universe. But the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem is independent of any physical description of that moment. Their theorem implies that the quantum vacuum state, which may have characterized the early universe, and which some popularizers have misleadingly and inaccurately referred to as nothing, that quantum vacuum state cannot be eternal in the past, but must have had an absolute beginning. In fact, even if our universe is just a tiny part of a wider multiverse of universes, their theorem implies that the multiverse itself must have had an absolute beginning in the finite past. Now, of course, highly speculative scenarios, such as loop quantum gravity, string models, even closed time-like curves, have been proposed to try to avoid this absolute beginning. All of these models are fraught with problems. But the bottom line is that none of these theories, even if true, succeeds in restoring an eternal past. Last year at Cambridge University, at a conference celebrating the 70th birthday of Stephen Hawking, Vilenkin delivered a paper entitled, "Did the Universe Have a Beginning?" in which he surveyed contemporary cosmology with regard to that question. He argued, and I quote, "None of these scenarios can actually be past eternal." He concluded, and I quote, "All the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning." But then the inevitable question arises. Why did the universe come into being? What brought the universe into existence? There must have been a transcendent cause which brought the universe into being. We can summarize our argument thus far as follows. Premise 1, the universe began to exist. 2, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a transcendent cause. 3, therefore, the universe has a transcendent cause. But what sort of a being could such a cause be? Well, by the very nature of the case, that cause must be a transcendent, immaterial being beyond space and time. Now, there are only two types of thing that could possibly fit such a description. Either an abstract object, like a number, or else an unembodied mind or consciousness. But abstract objects don't stand in causal relations. The number 7, for example, has no effect upon anything. It therefore follows that the cause of the universe is plausibly an unembodied mind or person. And thus we are brought not merely to a transcendent cause of the universe, but to its personal creator. Number 3, God is the best explanation of the applicability of mathematics to the physical world. Philosophers and scientists have puzzled over what physicist Eugene Wigner called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. How is it that a mathematical theorist like Peter Higgs can sit down at his desk and by poring over mathematical equations predict the existence of a fundamental particle which 30 years later, after investing millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours, experimentalists are finally able to detect? Mathematics is the language of nature. But how is this to be explained? If mathematical objects are abstract entities causally isolated from the universe, then the applicability of mathematics to the physical world is, in the words of philosopher of mathematics Mary Lang, a happy coincidence. On the other hand, if mathematical objects are just useful fictions, then how is it that nature is written in the language of these fictions? The naturalist has no explanation for the uncanny applicability of mathematics to the physical world. By contrast, the theist has a ready explanation. When God created the physical universe, he designed it on the mathematical structure that he had in mind. We can summarize this argument as follows. Premise 1, if God did not exist, then the applicability of mathematics would be a happy coincidence. 2, the applicability of mathematics is not a happy coincidence. 3, therefore, God exists. Number 4, God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. In recent decades, scientists have been stunned by the discovery that the initial conditions of the Big Bang were fine-tuned for the existence of intelligent life with a precision and delicacy that literally defy human comprehension. This fine-tuning is of two sorts. First, when the laws of nature are expressed as mathematical equations, you find appearing in them certain constants. For example, the gravitational constant. The values of these constants are not determined by the laws of nature. Second, in addition to these constants, there are certain arbitrary quantities which are simply put in as initial conditions on which the laws of nature then operate. For example, the amount of entropy in the early universe. Now, these constants and quantities all fall into an exquisitely narrow range of life-permitting values. Were these constants and quantities to be altered by even a hair's breadth, the life-permitting balance would be destroyed and life would not exist anywhere in the cosmos. Now, there are 3 live explanatory options for this extraordinary fine-tuning: either physical necessity, chance, or design. Physical necessity, however, is not a plausible explanation because the finely tuned constants and quantities are independent of the laws of nature, and therefore they are not physically necessary. So, could the fine-tuning be the result of chance? Well, the problem with this hypothesis is that the odds of a life-permitting universe are so infinitesimal that they cannot be reasonably faced. And therefore, the proponents of chance have been forced to resort to the postulate of the existence of a world ensemble of other universes, preferably infinite in number and randomly ordered, undetectable by us, so that life-permitting universes would appear by chance somewhere in the ensemble. Not only is this hypothesis, to borrow Richard Dawkins' phrase, an unparsimonious extravagance, but it also faces an insuperable objection. As Roger Penrose of Oxford University has pointed out, by far, most of the observable universes in a world ensemble would be worlds in which a single brain fluctuates into existence out of the quantum vacuum and observes its otherwise empty world. Such worlds are incomprehensibly more probable than finely tuned worlds like ours. And thus, if our universe were just a random member of a world ensemble, we ought to be having observations like that. Since we don't, that strongly disconfirms the world ensemble hypothesis. And so chance is also not a good explanation. It therefore follows logically that design is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe. And therefore, the fine-tuning of the universe, I think, constitutes evidence for the existence of a cosmic designer. Number 5, God is the best explanation of intentional states of consciousness in the world. Philosophers are puzzled by states of intentionality. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, intentionality is the property of being about something or of something. It signifies the object-directedness of our thoughts. For example, I can think about my summer vacation, or I can think of my wife. No physical object has this sort of intentionality. A chair, or a stone, or a glob of tissue like the brain is not about or of something else. Only mental states of consciousness are about other things. A materialist philosopher like Alex Rosenberg recognizes this fact and so concludes that on atheism, there really are no intentional states. Rosenberg boldly claims that we never really think about anything. But this seems incredible. Obviously, I am thinking about Rosenberg's argument. This seems to me to be a reductio ad absurdum of atheism. By contrast, on theism, because God is a mind, it's hardly surprising that there should also be finite minds. And thus intentional states fit comfortably into a theistic worldview. So, we may argue, 1, if God did not exist, intentional states of consciousness would not exist. 2, but intentional states of consciousness do exist, from which it follows logically 3, therefore God exists. Number 6, God is the best explanation of objective moral values and duties in the world. In moral experience, we apprehend moral values and duties which impose themselves as objectively binding and true. For example, we all recognize that it's morally wrong to walk into an elementary school with an automatic weapon and to shoot little boys and girls and their teachers. On a naturalistic view, however, there's nothing really wrong with that. Moral values are just the subjective byproducts of biological evolution and social conditioning. Rosenberg is brutally honest about the implications of his atheism. He declares, and I quote, "There is no such thing as morally right or wrong. Human individual life is meaningless and without ultimate moral value. We need to face the fact that moral nihilism is true." End quote. By contrast, the theist grounds objective moral values in God and our moral duties in his commandments. The theist thus has the explanatory resources which the atheist lacks to ground objective moral values and duties. Hence, we may argue, 1, objective moral values and duties exist. 2, but if God did not exist, objective moral values and duties would not exist, from which it follows logically, 3, therefore God exists. Number 7, the historical facts concerning the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, was by all accounts a remarkable individual. New Testament historians have reached something of a consensus that the historical Jesus came on the scene with an unprecedented sense of divine authority, the authority to stand and speak in God's place. He claimed that in himself the kingdom of God had come, and as visible demonstrations of this fact, he carried out a ministry of miracle working and exorcisms. That's why the Jewish leadership instigated his crucifixion on the charge of blasphemy. But the supreme confirmation of Jesus' radical personal claims was his resurrection from the dead. If Jesus of Nazareth really rose from the dead, then it would seem that we have a divine miracle on our hands, and thus evidence for the existence of God. Now, I appreciate that most people would probably say that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just believe in by faith or not. But I think they might be surprised to know that there are actually 3 established facts recognized by the majority of New Testament historians today, which I believe are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus. Namely, his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the very origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. Let me say a brief word about each one of these 3 facts. Fact number 1, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers on the Sunday morning after his crucifixion. According to Jakob Kramer, who is an Austrian scholar who has specialized in the study of the resurrection, and I quote, "By far, most scholars hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb," end quote. According to D.H. Van Dalen, it is extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. Those who deny it, he says, do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions. Fact number 2, on separate occasions, different individuals and groups of people saw appearances of Jesus alive after his death. According to Gerd Ludemann, a prominent German New Testament critic, and I quote, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ," end quote. These appearances were witnessed not only by believers, but also by skeptics, unbelievers, and even enemies of the early Jesus movement. Fact number 3, the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Just think of the situation that the disciples faced following Jesus' crucifixion. Number 1, their leader was dead. And Jewish messianic expectations included no idea of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed by them as a criminal. Second, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the general resurrection at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples suddenly came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus of Nazareth from the dead that they were willing to go to their deaths for the truth of this belief. Some sort of explanation is required to generate this conviction. Luke Johnson, a New Testament scholar at Emory University, states, some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, concludes, that is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. Attempts to explain away these three great facts, like the disciples stole the body, or Jesus wasn't really dead, have been universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The simple fact is that there just is no plausible, naturalistic explanation of these three facts. And therefore, it seems to me, the Christian is amply justified in believing that Jesus rose from the dead and was who he claimed to be. But that entails that God exists. We can summarize this argument then as follows. One, there are three established facts concerning the fate of Jesus of Nazareth: the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of his disciples' belief in his resurrection. Two, the hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, is the best explanation of these facts. Three, the hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, entails that God exists. Four, therefore, God exists. And thus we have a good inductive argument for the existence of God from the fact of Jesus' resurrection. Finally, number 8, God can be personally known and experienced. This isn't really an argument for God's existence. Rather, it's the claim that you can know that God exists wholly apart from arguments, simply by personally experiencing him. Philosophers call beliefs like this properly basic beliefs. They aren't based on some other beliefs. Rather, they're part of the foundations of a person's system of beliefs. Other properly basic beliefs would include belief in the reality of the past or the reality of the external world around you. In the same way, belief in God is, for those who seek him, a properly basic belief grounded in our personal experience of God. Now, if this is the case, then there's a real danger that arguments for God's existence could actually distract your attention from God himself. The Bible promises, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. We mustn't so concentrate on the external arguments that we fail to hear the inner voice of God speaking to our own hearts. For those who listen, God becomes a personal reality in their lives. In summary, then, we've seen 8 respects in which God provides a better explanation of the data of human experience than atheism. God is the best explanation of why anything at all exists. God is the best explanation of the origin of the universe. God is the best explanation of the applicability of mathematics to the physical world. God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. God is the best explanation of intentional states of consciousness in the world. God is the best explanation of the existence of objective moral values and duties in the world. God is the best explanation of the historical facts concerning Jesus' resurrection. And finally, God can be personally known and experienced. Now, I can imagine that there are some of you here tonight who are silently thinking that all of these arguments for God's existence are well and good, but are ultimately just so much labor lost. For don't we live, after all, in a postmodern culture in which appeals to such apologetic arguments are no longer effective, since postmodernists reject the traditional canons of logic, rationality, and truth? Rational arguments for the truth of the Christian faith no longer are supposed to work. Rather, in today's culture, we should just share our narrative and invite people to participate in it. I believe that this sort of thinking is guilty of a disastrous misdiagnosis of contemporary culture. The idea that we live in a postmodern culture is a myth perpetrated in our churches by misguided youth pastors. In fact, a postmodern culture is an impossibility. It would be utterly unlivable. Nobody is a postmodernist when it comes to reading the labels on a bottle of aspirin and a box of rat poison. If you got a headache, you better believe that texts have objective meaning. People are not relativistic when it comes to matters of science, technology, and engineering. Rather, they are relativistic and pluralistic when it comes to religion and ethics. But of course, that's not postmodernism. That's modernism. That's just old line verificationism, which says that if you can't verify it by your five senses, then it's just a matter of personal taste and emotive expression. Our culture remains deeply modernist at heart. Otherwise, how do you make sense out of the popularity of the new atheism? Dawkins and his ilk are indelibly modernist and even scientistic in their approach. On the postmodernist reading of contemporary culture, their books should have fallen like water on a stone. Instead, they have been lapped up eagerly by people who are convinced that religious belief is folly and has nothing going for it intellectually. Seen in this light, the idea that we should tailor our proclamation of the gospel to a postmodern culture is a siren song for the church's destruction. Your old arguments are no longer effective, we're told. Lay them aside. They're of no use. Just share your narrative. And so we are deceived into voluntarily laying aside our most effective weapons of logic and evidence, thereby ensuring unawares modernism's triumph over us. If the church adopts this suicidal course of action, then the consequences in the next generation will be catastrophic. Christianity will be reduced to just one more voice in a cacophony of competing voices, each one sharing its narrative, and none of them claiming to commend itself as the objective truth about reality, while scientific naturalism continues to shape our culture's view of how the world really is. I believe that a robust natural theology may well be necessary in order for the gospel to be effectively heard. In general, Western culture is deeply post-Christian. It is the product of the Enlightenment, which introduced into European culture the leaven of secularism, which has now permeated the whole of Western society. It has been the overwhelming impact of the Enlightenment mentality that theological knowledge is not possible. The conviction is that the person who follows reason unflinchingly toward its end will be atheistic, or at best agnostic. And it is for that reason that Christians who depreciate the value of the arguments of natural theology, because, as they say, no one comes to faith through arguments, are being so short-sighted. For the value of natural theology extends far beyond your immediate evangelistic context. It is the broader task of Christian apologetics, including natural theology, to help create and sustain a cultural milieu in which the gospel can be heard as an intellectually viable option for thinking men and women today. It thereby gives people the intellectual permission to believe when their hearts are moved. As we progress further into the 21st century, it is critical that church be trained to intelligently articulate and defend its Christian faith.